You're watching Benchmark. The September edition of LMD states that although fears of another recession in the US may dampen confidence, it expects Sri Lanka's steady growth to continue. Benchmark's Anushan Selvaraj decided to find out a bit more about chances of a double-dip recession in the US and the financial crises in the US and the Eurozone.
Welcome to the Voice of Business. On the show with me this week is economist with Standard Chartered Bank and LMD columnist Samantha Amarasinghe. Now, Samantha, your column in LMD concludes that fears that the US may be facing another recession may dampen confidence, but you expect the steady growth to continue. Can you elaborate on this?
Sure. The uncertain global environment presents new challenges and risks, but we remain confident that Sri Lanka's growth prospects for the second half of the year and into 2012 will remain intact. This is largely due to the current strength in domestic demand, and we even see some potential upside to our 7.8% full-year growth forecast. Sri Lanka's strong macro fundamentals should help it withstand the external risks of weaker global growth, and we expect stronger FDI inflows and the significant government spending on infrastructure to ensure that Sri Lanka bucks the global slowdown in the second half of this year.
Now, following the US ratings downgrade and nervousness on Europe's financial front, you say that business and consumer confidence could well come under fire, but also that Asia and Sri Lanka may be somewhat immune to this. How come, especially given our heavy reliance on the export markets in the West?
Yes, heavy reliance on export markets in the West. However, Sri Lanka has relatively low exposure to external trade, and the country's strong macro fundamentals at present give policymakers some leeway to counter such headwinds. For instance, if we take the government debt to GDP ratio, it's high but manageable at approximately 82%, and this in fact is trending lower, implying that fiscal stimulus could be used to support economic development. Also, the fall in commodity prices should reduce the balance of payments pressures and improve the inflation outlook. Furthermore, workers' remittances remain strong, while the recent further relaxation of foreign exchange controls, such as allowing foreigners to invest in unit trusts, should strengthen FX reserves, which are already at a healthy $8.1 billion. And these high reserves give Sri Lanka more room for policy maneuver. But what this does point to in the future is a need for greater export diversification in terms of export markets and products.
The likes of China, India and Indonesia, as you say, may withstand any fallout from the dual crises because of their significant domestic demand. But why do you say that, quote, Sri Lanka too falls into this category? Could you explain this in layman's terms, if possible, Samantha?
Given the interconnectedness of global markets, export-dependent economies with large exposures to the US and/or Europe are likely to feel the heat the most. And so countries such as Indonesia, India and China, owing to their lower exposure to external trade on account of their significant domestic demand component, have shown a relatively limited correlation with the global economic cycle. And we feel Sri Lanka too falls into this category as it has a relatively low exposure to external trade. In fact, its current global share of external trade is something like 0.1%, and exports contribute just 18% of GDP. That said, the threat of an export-driven slowdown in the second half of this year lurks, even for Sri Lanka, as the US and Europe are significant markets for its exports.
Now, which countries or regions are likely to feel the heat of the US Eurozone scale down, and why?
Well, Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, Malaysia and Thailand are likely to feel the heat the most, as they're very much export-dependent economies, whereas countries like India and China have much larger domestic demand components. So overall, we believe growth should hold up reasonably well in emerging markets and in Asia. But this is very much contingent on China maintaining the level of growth it is currently seeing, which is in the range of 9 to 10%.
That was Samantha Amarasinghe speaking to Anushan Selvaraj. Well, that's our show this week. We hope you enjoyed. Thank you for tuning in.